Hello, everybody. On behalf of Baker McKenzie's Asia Pacific Industrials Manufacturing and Transportation Industry Group, welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, Ask the Experts, Supply Chain Digitalization in the Industrials Manufacturing and Transportation Sector. My name is Yaeko Hodaka, the chair of the AP-IMT Industry Group based in the firm's Tokyo office, and today I'm joined by my colleagues Petterd, the lead partner of the firm's AP Supply Chains service line and the chair of the Asia Pacific International Commercial and Trade Practice Group based in Sydney. Adrian Lawrence, the lead partner of the firm's Digital Transformation Service line and the chair of the Asia Pacific Technology, Media and Telecommunication Industry Group, also based in Sydney. And Riza Buditomo, a partner in the firm's International Commercial and Trade Practice Group based in Jakarta. And last but not least, Ning Liu, Senior Transfer Pricing Advisor and Senior Economist at our Baker McKenzie Fenchon Shanghai office. I'm also delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Ben Simpfendorfer, the CEO of Silk Road Associates. Digitalization in IMT sector has two aspects. One is digitalization of engineering chain, and the other is supply chain digitalization. But unfortunately, until now, the speed in supply chain digitalization has been rather slow in the IMT sector, primarily due to the existing the large volume of legacy system. But without development of the digitalization, it is apparent that the players will lose their competitiveness. For example, according to the Japanese government report, in case we don't see the sufficient level of the digital transformation, we will suffer an economic loss of $100 billion USD every year after 2025. So we decided to pick up this topic today, and during session, Ben will share his insights on supply chain digitalization issues for the IMT sector, how global supply chain disruptions are continuing to impact the industry, and how companies are adapting technologies in their supply chains across Asia Pacific. Our panel discussion will also address some of these points, as well as key risk areas, including cybersecurity and data privacy. Before we begin, I would like to share a few housekeeping reminders. This session is being recorded. The slides and the recording of today's webinar will be provided in the follow-up communication. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions at any point of today's session. We'll be addressing these during the panel discussion, and we will do our best to get to all of them. And now, without further ado, I will hand over to Ben Simpfendorfer, who will kick us off with a presentation on key supply chain digitalization trends he's seeing in the IMT sector in the Asia Pacific region. Ben, over to you, please.
Yaeko, many thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about what is such an exciting topic. Global supply chains are definitely on the move, and digitalization is a driving force and a supportive force for many of those changes. Next slide, please. There are four topics I would like to focus on today, and that is to provide us some context to how supply chains are moving and what it means for the IMT sector. And then to talk more specifically about how digitalization will shake up the supply chain and the fact that COVID has accelerated digital adoption rates, but nevertheless, we can't be too over-optimistic because we're talking about a sector that is often somewhat traditional, and digitalization rates are strong among leading firms, but there are many laggard firms out there. And so we need to be reasonable in our expectations. Next slide, please. But if we could kick off by taking a look at the global supply chain for the IMT sector, what this shows you is exports of IMT products by every country around the world. The bigger the circle, the greater the exports. And what's clear from this graph is that there are three hubs for global IMT exports, specifically in North Asia, in Europe, and North America. There are very few low-cost exporters of these products. There is heavy concentration in those three markets, but more importantly, those three markets are relatively have even shares of exports, and that's not the case for all products. Next slide, please. So if we can look more specifically at other sectors, including consumer goods, technology and media, and health and life sciences, there are a few points that immediately pop out from this graph. And that is that for the consumer goods and technology and media sectors, North Asia typical share is anywhere from 50% up to nearly 3/4 of total exports. Greater concentrations of these products in North Asia relative to industrials, machineries, or transportation sector. Equally important, China accounts for a greater share of consumer goods and technology and media exports relative to industrials, machineries, and transportation. So again, this heavy concentration of activity in those two sectors, in North Asia in particular, and in China. Why is that important? Well, it means that we haven't seen quite the same global supply chain shifts in the industrial machineries and transportation sector that we have elsewhere. And that's partly because there is already significant capacity back in Europe and North America, but also less exposure to China, less exposure to tariffs or to trade bans. And so the global supply chain shifts have been less abrupt over the past year relative to some of those other sectors. Next slide, please. But we will begin to see further movement over the coming 12 months and coming 2 to 5 years, and there'll be 4 key drivers of that movement. The first will be firms adopting what are called China Plus One strategies. These are strategies where still a large share of production takes place in China, but firms are looking to diversify, to add a +1, if you like. Often they're relocating into markets such as Vietnam or Mexico, some of the few low-cost exporters that do accept or have the capacity to produce capital-intensive goods. The second strategy, though, will be in China for China, and that is continuing to produce product in China for the local market. And that's a pronounced trend among capital-intensive sectors, largely because China is a fast-growing and dynamic market for these sectors. Over the last 12 months, we've had conversations with European chemical companies, Japanese consumer goods companies. And what's quite clear in those conversations is that these firms are continuing to invest in capacity in China in order to sell to the local market. But against that trend, we do expect to see some reshoring as well. Companies looking to bring back a little bit of production home, but it's not going to happen rapidly, especially when we're talking about the IMT sector, capital-intensive sector. More likely, what we'll see is progress over 5, 10, even 20 years. Just as European and North American firms took 20 years to develop a supply chain in China, it might take that long to develop a supply chain back home. The final point, though, would be regulation. These are tariffs and export bans in particular, which are having a more abrupt effect on the movement of capacity around the region. So far, that effect is more pronounced in the TMT sector, especially semiconductors. We've seen some movement away from China back into Taiwan, for instance, in the manufacturing of server production. But it is regulation that we need to pay attention to, at least in the short term. Next slide, please. Talking more specifically about the digital supply chain, and much of the conversation today will focus on 3 parts of that supply chain, specifically manufacturing, logistics, as well as products and services. There are a few areas that I've detailed here that all those 3 components cover, but we can't forget that the supply chain is part of a broader digital enterprise. We need to remember that we're also talking about a digital workplace. We're talking about digital customer and channel management. So digitalization really is a trend that is impacting the full enterprise and not just the supply chain, but it is a supply chain we want to talk about today. Next slide, please. We are seeing some exciting developments in the digital infrastructure, 5G, of course, being among the most important. We're seeing rapid 5G rollouts across many countries in the world. These Rollouts are highlighted by the infographic here. What's so striking too is that the fastest rollouts are taking place in traditional exporters of IMT products, North Asia, Europe, and North America. And so these are supportive of the adoption of smart manufacturing and other digital technologies that we're going to discuss shortly. But that said, I must admit there is some wariness among firms about adoption of 5G technologies. Over the last 6 months, I've had conversations with 30 or more major manufacturers, and over those 60-minute discussions, 5G has been a question we've raised, and more often than not, firms have said, look, we're not quite ready for it. We recognize the potential, but it's going to be a few years before we really leverage that opportunity. Now let's move on and talk about three ideas or concepts specifically. The first is digital factories and analytics. Next slide, please. Some on the call may be already quite familiar with what are called smart factories. Not everyone will be though, so a useful analogy at this point is to compare a smart factory with the way that we might use a smart device, a wearable, for instance, that tracks our heart rate, tracks our blood pressure. That data is fed into the cloud and we can access it through an app, and it helps us to understand how our body is performing. A smart machine is much the same. These are machines that are connected wirelessly to the cloud. The data is fed into that cloud and then presented in an app, which an engineer, for instance, on the factory floor or even in home office can access in order to understand very important variables about that machine, such as the efficiency of production or whether maintenance is needed on a specific part of that machine. It allows the engineer to intervene in order to improve efficiency, to replace a part, and ultimately overall productivity gains can be quite significant. So smart manufacturing, a very exciting concept. But again, having had conversations with groups such as Honeywell and Rockwell and others around smart manufacturing, what becomes quite clear is that it's leading companies who are pushing forward in the adoption of smart machines. Not everyone is capable or has the capital to invest. So again, we're seeing a gap opening up between the leaders and the laggards. The leaders adopting smart manufacturing, the laggards perhaps struggling a little bit with the idea, but it nevertheless is an important development in the IMT sector. Next slide, please. Equally exciting is microfactories. Now, again, not necessarily a new idea, but the advances we've seen in digitalization and technologies generally have opened up the opportunities to a larger range of countries. So what is a microfactory? Well, typically it's a factory that has a relatively small footprint. It's a factory that often can be exportable. It's a highly automated process. It requires less energy and a smaller labor force. Often you can build a factory in an existing warehouse, in an existing factory. You don't have to build something new. And so your startup time can be as short as 6 months rather than 2 years. But also it's a very competitive way of producing low volume but highly specialized products. And that's great if you're looking to reshore, if you're looking to locate your factories closer to the consumer. And so it's an area where we expect to see significant growth, not just in the IMT sector. In fact, I was on a call recently with some of the world's largest apparel and footwear brands, and many of them are starting to build out micro factories. What's important here, though, is that it's not necessarily a replacement for the commoditized, large volume, low cost production that perhaps we see in China and other parts of the world. It's an additive, it's a complement. It's simply a slightly different way of business, but it is one to be paying attention to. Next slide, please. One of the fabulous outcomes of increasingly connected machines and factories is the data they generate and how we can use that data in particular to meet our ESG requirements. ESG is a concept that's talked a lot about of late, particularly ESG investment. But the reality is that in spite of the fact there are dozens of ESG ratings companies, there are hundreds of ESG data providers, we only perhaps track 10% of our actual activity. There is a real shortfall of data. Most of the attention is spent on looking at governance issues, relatively subjective measures of CSR strategies, ESG reporting, and so forth. Where we're going to get change relatively rapidly is around the reporting of more hard data on waste, energy use, water use. We'll be able to do that because of our connected machines, connected factories, because of the adoption of industrial Internet of Things, the ability to send that data to the cloud and then integrate and analyze that data. We may also be forced to move in that direction because of government's intervention and public policy. Listed companies may increasingly be required to disclose this data. And as a result of that, those leading companies who are investing in smart machines and smart factories will be more capable of reporting that type of data and reaping the benefits as a result. Next slide, please. The second concept I wanted to cover was digital logistics, where again, we are beginning to see some real change. Next slide. Many on the call will be very familiar with a typical 3PL supply chain involving packaging, warehousing, and transportation. But a 4PL, 5PL are increasingly common. Not necessarily new ideas, but they are adopting new technologies. And so the types of services they're performing are beginning to change the way we think of logistics. 4PL is best known for providing, yes, 3PL services, but using data analytics in innovative ways to reduce logistics costs. Amazon are the best example here. Amazon can provide their distributors with a full range of logistics services, packaging, warehousing, and transportation, but it's the way they're using the data they collect, data on how goods are purchased, at what time and where they're purchased, and how they need to move through the logistics chain. The way they're using this data is helping to reduce overall logistics costs, but also to improve delivery times. And these types of developments are quite exciting and will continue to grow. And we may even see the same e-commerce players moving not just into the logistics space, but into the ownership of logistics assets. It's that exciting combination of both data and assets, which could have pronounced disruption on the overall logistics chain. And again, of course, let's not forget 5PL, where RFID and blockchain are increasingly having a real impact. RFD is one particularly exciting development where we may be able to use it to verify the provenance of a product, particularly at a time when supply chain traceability is increasingly important to us as consumers, but also regulators and governments. Next slide, please. But we're also seeing disruption in terms of optical recognition. A great example here is virtual controlled codex systems, which create digital twins of air cargo assets and share that data to the cloud. These digital twins allow us to identify whether there is any damage to the cargo asset prior to being shipped. And that allows us to protect against any liabilities. We can also more accurately measure freight volume and therefore be able to either manage our costs or manage our sales price. Next slide, please. We're also seeing disruption in the way freight forwarders are pricing their business. A great example here is Freightos, an internet platform not dissimilar to Expedia in the way it works in the freight forwarding industry. Freight forwarding can be quite unique insofar that something of a lagging industry. Often communications are by email or by fax. It can take days to get a quote, and often the quotes are relatively secretive. They're not always public knowledge. Freightos is looking to disrupt that model by aggregating freight forwarders onto a single platform, much as Expedia aggregates hotels and airlines and others, and then to provide a single point for shippers to find a freight forwarder at the best possible price and to provide quotes that are almost instantaneous. Quite a change for the industry. Freightos is also embedding its platform onto Alibaba's B2B offering. So not only can a business purchase a product through Alibaba, but can arrange a freight forwarding service at the same time, receiving competitive and again, almost instantaneous bids. Next slide, please. The final the final subject to talk about is digital products and services, where again, we're seeing real change driven by digitalization. Two examples here. The first is the way we're using 3D design. So in the past, designers typically wanted to touch and feel the physical product. They needed to be able to send the product to the factory and to receive the product from the factory, all of which slowed down the design time. But because of COVID-19, that just wasn't possible. And so increasingly designers are using 3D swatches, for instance, in the apparel and fashion industry. They're visualizing those swatches and designs on 75 plus real body shapes, and they're able to share the finished product with the factory. And a lot of that is instantaneous. So it's created a real mindset change in the industry. Next slide, please. A more pertinent example for the IMT industry would be Built Robotics. Here is a company that provides the software and equipment that allows you to turn your existing construction equipment into an autonomous piece of equipment. It becomes self-driving, if you like. So again, what's very interesting about this business model is that Built Robotics is not creating the actual equipment itself. It's simply providing the software and the equipment that allow you to use your existing asset base. And then they are charging that as a service fee for any time you switch on the autonomous mode. So it's essentially software as a service. So again, it's still early days for the business, and we have to see where it goes, but that disruption in the industry will be quite pronounced when we see non-asset owners providing software as a service able to disrupt a traditional industry, such as the construction equipment industry, and turning these pieces of equipment into sort of self-driving, into a self-driving mode becomes quite exciting. So a lot's happening across the sector, both changes in the global supply chain and digitalization across the full supply chain and the digital enterprise. But perhaps I'll leave it there and give it back to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. I think that's been a great way of setting the scene in, I don't know about the audience, but when you sort of initially might say, oh, we're talking about digitization of the supply chain. So some of us, it can be like, well, actually, what does that mean? And in particular, what does that mean for the IMT sector? And I think what you've just explained, even just using those sort of three focus areas, really gives some good substance to understanding it can mean several different things, and depending on what particular businesses are doing. So my name's Petterd, and I'm going to be moderating today's panel discussion. And I'm pleased to say I'm joined by my colleagues, Adrian Lawrence, Riza Buditomo and Ning Liu, and also very pleased that Ben is going to join the panel discussion as well for any further questions. Now, some of you very kindly sent us some questions beforehand. Thank you very much for that. And what we've tried to do is weave responding to those questions through the panel comments that we've prepared. But we also have a Q&A function there. If people have further questions, please submit them, and if we have time, we will respond to those as well. And so let me get into the panel session. And as I said, there's a range of digital considerations for the IMT sector, just like any other sector when they're thinking about digitization of the supply chain. Ben's touched on smart manufacturing, robotics, micro factories, and there's different issues with all of those. Micro factories, for example, might bring more flexibility to move parts of the supply chain around. We've also had a focus on logistics. I think often with supply chain discussions, we focus a lot on the manufacturing, but there's also important logistics issues and ESG issues to consider. And so what we'd like to do in the panel is talk a bit more about some of those issues, but also look at things with, from a bit more of a jurisdictional specific perspective in some cases. And so with that in mind, I'm going to come to you first, Riza. So Riza is in Indonesia. And so Riza, what do you think would be a driver for IMT digitisation in a jurisdiction, particularly looking at things from Indonesian lens?
Thank you, Anne. I think digitization is a different in its jurisdictions depending on the focus and the policy of the government itself. For example, in Indonesia, there is what we call as Industry 4.0 blueprint, which encourages the development of industry and to the certain extent marks the era of industrializations in Indonesia. The Indonesia 4.0 blueprint focuses on several industries. For example, the automotive, the food and beverages, the chemicals, and e-commerce as well. In addition to that, policy and guidance would not going to be implemented fully if there is no strong legal basis to support that. In Indonesia, the boost of the development of industry and investment has been fully supported by the Indonesian parliament as well as the government, where they have approved the issuance what we call the omnibus law a couple of months ago. This includes changes in the industrial law itself, most significant on the easiness of business, the licensing processes, and as well as matters that are now fully controlled by the central government. On this note, of course, that for other countries which do not focuses on mass productions or industrializations, digitizations will be very different in approaching that. And
thanks, Riza. I like one phrase you used, the easiness of doing business, and one thing I know that we've been talking about a lot, and we're getting more and more requests from clients about, well, what are the incentives that a government is offering to relocate part of a supply chain or build up supply chain in a particular jurisdiction. And we know that most countries have incentive packages out there. But what are your thoughts on some of these, particularly the fiscal incentive packages, are they making a difference, particularly to IMT supply chain digitization decisions?
I would say largely yes, because there is a particular pull factors that can incentivize the development of the industry or the IMT in a particular jurisdictions. For example, tax holiday incentive are given to boost the development, construction of industry. But at the same time, we also need to be careful. If there is a fiscal incentive, they would also probably, on the other hand, a specific measure that is being conducted by that government. For example, in Indonesia, there is now what they call a new digital tax, and the possible of increase of VAT rate that are already being discussed currently. In addition to also the specific current discussions on the increase of the income tax for specific individuals as well. So when the economic becomes higher, and then you need to also be careful or at least to take considerations in other perspectives as well. This may impact the industrializations or the IMT or the digitizations process. The increase of VAT will cause additional burden on cash flow, of course, for the manufacturer, because they need to buy the materials and to pay for that materials with additional value-added tax. And at the end of the day, it will going to increase the price to the price that is going to be paid by the consumers. Now, we also need to take a look of the trends and audits, tax audits, and as well as customs audits, because that also is going to give another flavor of one is making decisions on how to implement the digitizations in a way. There have been talks and ideas to incentivize companies with implementing strong digitizations over its supply chain and manufacturing facilities, but nothing it really comes into a concrete solutions right now.
Great, thanks, Riza. I think while we're on a tax theme, we might stay there. So I might move to you now, Ning. And so Ning sits in China, and I'd be particularly interested sort of on your take on these issues from a China perspective, for picking up on Riza's comments. How do you think digitization is going to affect tax planning of supply chains, particularly for IMT industries going forward?
Thanks, Anne. So yeah, for multinationals who own global-wide supply chains, the digitalization process will likely change how value is created along the value chain. Let's think about an example. Think about a logistics service providers. So in order to stay competitive on the market, it may have to put in place a sort of like a online platform that will automatically connect the orders from the customers with the internal and external resources and do the best matching so that it will increase the efficiency of the whole process and create values for the customers and also for the company. So the platform might do so by employing fairly complicated algorithms or even something like artificial intelligence. So basically, this platform will create some critical value for the enterprise group, for the company, and the entity who do contributions, like the entity who develop, enhance, maintain, protect, and exploit this online platform, and also the corresponding data, would be actually contributing critical value to the entire value chain, to the enterprise group. So from a tax and the transfer pricing perspectives, the multinationals enterprise group might need to reallocate its total system profit along its value chain, so that the profit allocation is realigned with the value creation. Because from a tax and transfer pricing perspectives, the remuneration has to be aligned with the function performed and the risk taken. And also the enterprise group need to carefully handle the IP created through this digitalization process, because the entity who own the critical IP in the group would normally be the party who bear the major market risk and also keep the lion's share of the system profit, and that all will have some significant tax consequences. And then come back to focus on China. I think the picture in China is more complicated, because as we all know, that many multinationals who have operation in China, they actually facing the challenge of restructuring their global supply chain between China and the rest of the world. And the digitalization process will be a very critical consideration in this restructuring process, because you need to think carefully where you want to put your critical value creation activities, functions, and also where you want to put your valuable assets, such as the intangibles, as critical to the operation of the entire supply chain.
Thanks, Ning. I mean, it's sort of me not being a tax lawyer, it sort of resonates with me. The importance of checking things like that. Whatever changes are made, it must be consistent with what the business is now doing, and I guess is an important thing that with making changes to supply chains, the accounting in that obviously needs to keep up to date, and also things like intellectual property cannot be forgotten. I also want to pick up with you on something that Riza mentioned. I think Riza made a brief comment about a digital tax for Indonesia, but we know sort of a few jurisdictions have been looking at things like digital taxes. And so for an industry like IMT, do they need to, players in that industry, do they need to worry about digital tax that's been proposed by some countries and that the OECD have been looking at?
That's a great question. Well, let's just talk a little bit background on the digitalization before we get into the question. So the reason why the digitalization is brought up is because, I mean, we know some high-tech firms, multinational high-tech firms, they can generate some significant revenues in certain market countries, but they don't have a taxable entities in the traditional sense in these market countries. So these countries cannot tax these revenues and the profit. Facing the challenge, the tax challenge created by digitalization as being a top priority for OECD and G20 in their inclusive framework. So basically, in order to handle that, OECD has brought up the so-called two-pillar system, the blueprint, in which the pillar one system is actually supposed to deal with this digitalization issue. What it does is basically you want to give the market countries more taxing right by changing the by putting in place new nexus rules. So basically, how the entities and how the revenue is connected with the market countries. So come back to the question. Well, the digitalization actually, it does not only affect the high-tech firms like the cross-border e-commerce or social medias who sell ads across borders. It also affects traditional business who produce and deliver final product and services to the end customers directly or indirectly. So yes, in that sense, some MT business could be affected. The digital taxation, the pillar one, might actually change affect or even change how the traditional business operate worldwide. For example, we know that some of these multinationals, they could adopt a so-called business service model in selling to the market countries. For example, they will set up a sales and marketing service supporting entities in the local country, but they will directly sell the product cross-border from overseas to the local country. So that the in a traditional sense, the market country can only tax the service entities. It cannot directly tax the tangible product that's sold directly cross-border. But in the era of the digital taxation, that this might be changed. Well, the OECD has promised to deliver the final version of the two-pillar blueprint by this summer. But we all know that there has been a lot of details that has not been finalized. So maybe things will not be so optimistic. But we will closely monitor the process and flag any issues.
Thanks very much, Ning. I mean, there's obviously quite a lot of complexity there, and I appreciate not everybody on here are tax experts, but I guess the key takeaway is if you're making any changes, just have some awareness of the potential for these digital taxes to be something that might impact, and working through what that impact is as you think through every other thing that needs to be thought about when you're working through supply chain disruption issues. And so, look, I'll move on now and come to you, Adrian, to talk about all things digital. But which of course is sort of the whole scope of what we're talking about today, and Ben gave some great examples sort of earlier. We're talking about bringing digitization in for IMT supply chains with smart manufacturing, with robotics. Excuse me. What are some of the examples that we're actually seeing, and some of the issues that are being raised by IMT businesses when they're looking to bring in these transformation technologies?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. It's a great question, because I think we are seeing a development over time. I think if we went back 3-5 years, what we were seeing were a lot of sort of scoping studies, a lot of investigation of what firms might try to do. But now we're actually starting to see actual implementation of projects in the supply chain space. And I think it's interesting to look at Ben's sort of 3 different categories and look at where the activity is happening. But if you do that, I think you get pretty rapidly to the proposition that implementing these kinds of technologies really is a whole of business or whole of enterprise activity. It's not really possible to sort of jump straight into, we're going to decide overnight to implement robotics in our warehouse, because there's a significant platform of digitization that needs to be laid to be able to do that involves a transformation of the internal business operations of a firm, implementation of cloud technologies, for example, as a starting point. So if you look then at the kinds of legal issues that are going to come up as a firm goes on that digitization journey, you start with, in some senses fairly straightforward, but potentially, difficult and complex acquisition transactions. You need to actually acquire that technology. Some of it you might build yourself, that sort of classic distinction between acquisition and build. You have really interesting questions about what you do with your workforce. So interesting employment questions. Ning's already talked about the tax issues that start to look quite different as you go through a digitization process. But one thing that really comes out of all of that is the shift towards utilization of data. And that's a theme that goes through each of Ben's 3 categories, that really to sensibly implement any of these systems, you need to think very carefully about how you collect and use your own data sets, how you might be able to deploy them, just understanding what those are in the first place, to interact with some of these technologies in a way that's actually going to be efficient, and not just an attempt to implement a new technology that sort of struggles because the rest of the business is not ready for that.
So I think it'd be good if we sort of dive down a bit more into data. So in particular, what sort of risks are we seeing with this increased use and the proliferation of this use of data?
Yeah, look, it's tempting to always answer a question, for any lawyer to answer a question about data by talking about privacy. And, I don't want to minimize the importance and impact of privacy, but actually a lot of the data that we're talking about here, as you digitize a business and a supply chain, is actually not personal information. It's business information. It's information about supply chains, about suppliers, about products as they move around the world, about efficiency of operations of factories, etc. And so I think sometimes the focus on personal information and the press that gets, that issue gets, is a little overblown in this space. That's not to say there aren't a whole lot of important and interesting legal issues, though. And a lot of those, you might talk more generally about data governance. And I think firms are now starting to understand that actually understanding and regulating their own data sets, how they use them, how they share that data with third parties, how they aggregate data to create value, that's a really important driver of compliance within a firm, but also of value within a firm. And that applies not just to personal information. There may well be subsets of data that are regulated by GDPR and privacy laws in our region, but that's that broader set of data. When you get to that point, you realize very quickly that cybersecurity, that for many years has perhaps been the sort of the poor cousin of privacy regulation, that becomes a much more important question. And we've certainly seen some spectacular challenges across firms, including in the IT space, where cybersecurity hasn't been sufficient, that can really cripple the operations of not just one firm, but an entire supply chain. If a logistics provider, for example, is the subject of a significant cyber attack. So what we're talking to a lot of our clients about now really is, how do they come up the curve from a cybersecurity perspective? How does that interact with their legal obligations, their relationship with third parties? We're starting to see laws become much more specific in that space, where, go back only 5 years, let alone 10, what most jurisdictions had was a very basic cybersecurity obligation, probably sitting in their privacy law. Now we're getting much more detailed sector by sector obligations. We're starting to have jurisdictions like Australia, but others as well, talk about critical infrastructure and having much more direct government oversight of cybersecurity compliance where there is a piece of critical infrastructure. That's starting to be defined very broadly. The whole transport sector, for example, in Australia is slated to become part of what we would consider critical infrastructure and have a set of additional overlay of obligations in respect of cybersecurity. So that's very much a space to watch in terms of consideration of risks around data.
Thanks, Adrian. And maybe just briefly, because I want to move over and get some comments from Ben, but we had a few questions sort of about ESG, and Ben touched on it in his comments. Are we seeing in digitalisation of supply chain, are we seeing sort of digitalisation being used to address things like ESG compliance as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ben mentioned it briefly on the way through, that sort of the use of technologies like blockchain to think about provenance is starting to become much more prevalent. We were involved in a project a couple of years ago now with the World Wildlife Fund, for example, to implement a blockchain system to track sustainably caught produce. Obviously a slightly different industry sector, but thinking about that supply chain question of, how do you know throughout your supply chain, including ultimately right up to the point at which you might eat a piece of tuna on a plate, how can you be certain that that tuna has been sustainably caught in the place that it was caught, that it has been kept safely all the way through the supply chain? Blockchain is obviously a classic technology that enables you to track that. The final thing I'll say about that is that I think people often think that blockchain kind of sits on its own, separate from the real world, particularly when we're talking about these kinds of projects. There's a clear interface with the real world in that we're actually tracking physical product around the world. So that whole question about the infrastructure to enable that to happen, which takes us back to things like 5G, to enable data to be input into blockchain projects, that's as much an important element of a blockchain-based supply chain solution as the software or the system that might enable that at the centre.
Right. Thanks very much, Adrian. Ben, I might turn to you now, and maybe I can ask you sort of to respond to two issues. The second one is sort of listening to the panel discussion and what you were talking about earlier. I'd sort of appreciate sort of any observations you've got. But the first point would be good for you to address is your important question of cost, which you probably haven't spent nearly enough time on. But yeah, what are your thoughts on how supply chain digitalisation is actually going to impact supply chain costs for the IMT sector?
I guess there's an immediate cost impact and long-term cost impact. The immediate cost impact is perhaps more on our operational costs. So certainly my conversations with some of the big global companies with complex supply chains, what's clear is that when we go back to a sort of a post-COVID normal, if you like, there'll be far less international travel. And there's a recognition that certainly for the supply chain industry that people spend a lot of time on planes, having to visit factories and do audits. And so where they can cut back on that, that will be key. And the ability to not have to visit head office anymore is fabulous. In terms of the long-term impact, I guess the challenge around costs is that digitalization is a fabulous way to reduce costs in many areas, but you've got to invest to do that. And that's a challenge, particularly at a point in time when there's uncertainty around global demand. And so I would expect that the cost impact immediately will be perhaps smaller than we would like, but we're going to see it unfold out over time. But it'll take companies to have the appetite to invest in those new technologies, and that's not easy for all.
Thanks very much, Ben. And yes, would appreciate sort of your insights on just hearing the panel members and what further observations you have on the issues we've been talking about.
Yeah, I thought Adrian's point on data is critical because the supply chain is complex because of the sheer number of actors involved, and in order to digitalize the supply chain usually means you have to share data. And that can be uncomfortable for some firms. So you take the digitalization of trade financing, for instance, there needs to be data sharing between the buyer and let's say the bank. And to date, not all buyers are prepared to share or provide direct API access to their ERP systems to allow banks to understand more about the creditworthiness of a particular supplier. So the banks, for instance, are having to effectively recapture all the information available in trade invoices, which is a duplication of work. So there are some real challenges there in terms of data sharing. And equally too, the manufacturing sector, insofar that smart machines are sending data to the cloud, well, the manufacturing industry has always been a prime cybersecurity target, right? Because that information could contain valuable IP, it could contain valuable competitor information, and so the ability to secure that information will be quite important. And for an industry that perhaps traditionally hasn't worked with data, in that sort of aspect, it needs to be top of mind. It's just critical to the industry survival.
Thanks very much, Ben. We've got a little bit of time up our sleeve. Riza, I'm wondering if I might come back to you, just picking up on something else that we were going to touch upon. And I know sort of you focus in particular on the automotive industry, and I'm wondering, what are your thoughts sort of particularly there? What are you seeing as key trends for supply chain digitalisation for the automotive industry and risks that are associated with that?
Thanks, Anne. I think one of the main topics with regard to that specific industry on the tiered supply chains, where basically on digitizations on to have that supply chain in it, we are wondering where are the suppliers and the vendors to be able to support certain products and as well as certain productions. if in the conventional supply chain, we would be able to basically know about where they are, and we are communicating directly to them with regard to any issues and ever. But in digitalizations, sometimes we now found that supply chain can be buying stuff and or basically buying products from only a platform when there is a middle platform that we buy from there. So that will that may become an issue for certain products and as well as the automotive industry, where there are lots of parts and components that need to be basically fulfilled in order to create the final products or in matters of vehicles in it matters. Another issue with buying from platform is basically on a mention of new supply chain model on financing as well, who are doing those financing for these suppliers and vendors, how they basically came up with the sufficient capital of funds to be able to support the supply of goods that we wanted to basically produce the products, and there as well because of the digitizations and as well of the e-commerce that is currently being a trend is with regard to the capacity of certain transportation mode of transportations. For example, I'm looking into Ben's one of Ben's slides where basically now people are starting to have a shortage of vessels capacity or basically an airplane capacity, because some currently are buying that capacity through online or basically through digital to secure some of the slots available. If we do not know as manufacturing on how to get that capacity, or a supplier who does not have that capacity, it may then hinder basically the supply of the goods and then also postpone and delay the productions. That would probably be some of the key issues or matters that are worth to further discuss.
Great, thanks, Riza. Yeah, I suspect we could very easily have a whole session just talking about what we've been calling sort of the disruption issues, particularly with logistics, with making this spare capacity available. I might be a big customer purchaser of freight capacity, but I have extra capacity and I see a market opportunity for myself in making that capacity available to others. So from customer, I turn service provider, and also sort of, we're seeing more and more disruption, financing of supply chain models as well. So maybe that's a teaser for a session that we might do another time. Look, I might wrap up the panel discussion there. Thank you everyone very much for joining us. Really appreciate your comments and insights. And Yaeko, if I may, I will hand over to you to wrap up.
Thank you, Anne. So if I try to summarize today's discussion, digitalization of supply chain is a key to sustainable business development for IMT sector. However, they will face a number of new legal issues that they didn't handle before as a traditional manufacturing company, such as cybersecurity and compliance issues arising out of the data monetization. In addition, such disruption will affect the whole operation of the companies, including tax and transfer pricing aspect. Once again, thank you very much, Ben, for joining us and sharing your insights in today's session. And to our panelists, Anne, Adrian, Riza, and Ning, thank you very much for sharing your insights and for making our session an engaging one. To all our attendees, thank you very much for your participation today. We hope that you got valuable takeaways and found this session an insightful one. Please feel free to connect with any of us should you have any questions or wish to discuss further any of the topics. Take care and have a good day. Bye-bye.